The thought of my affliction and my homelessness is wormwood and gall. My soul continually thinks of it and is bowed down within me. But I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. Says God's good word for us, God's beloved people. Thanks be to God. Amen. So, I used to work at a homeless shelter in Atlanta, Georgia, or in an Atlanta suburb called Decatur, but we're not going to get too specific about that. And this was at the height of the housing crisis. I started working there in 2011. And so if the economy started falling apart in 2008, we're full-on housing crisis mode in Atlanta. And Atlanta was one of the places hit particularly hard by the credit crunch, by the housing crisis. A lot of people got foreclosed on. A lot of people ended up super upside down in homes they could not afford in the Atlanta suburbs. And so they ended up in real need of help, and then they didn't get the help, and so they ended up homeless. They ended up at our shelter. It is still open. It's called Hagar's House in Decatur, Georgia. And so I worked there week in and week out. And I help the families, and our shelter serves exclusively women with children. And so women would come with their children, and they would have like 2, 3, 4, 5 children, and we had family-style living. And so that meant that each family lived in one single room. We didn't separate the women from their children. Some shelters do that. We did not do that. We really wanted to keep them together as a family. But that just meant they lived all together in one room. And so you can imagine when you had small children, imagine living in a one-room apartment with your children. It was not luxurious. It was the best we could do. It was a very well-run, well-maintained homeless shelter. I'm biased, but we did the best we could. And so we housed them overnight. We opened at like 6 p.m. and we closed at 8 a.m. every morning. And we had these families and we cared for them and I loved them. And I would watch the children in the playroom and I would serve dinner to the families. And I would sit there in judgment on the banks that loaned them this money and set up this ridiculous loan that they could not afford. And I passed judgment on the politicians who created a framework where you could pay interest only and this terrible mess that the politicians set up for them. And I also judged the banks like grounding our entire economy on this bad debt and then fell like a house of cards and the whole economy tanked. And I graduated into the worst job market since the Depression. I had some thoughts. And every day I was at that shelter. I was trying to make a difference in these families' lives. I would even keep the shelter. I would get up early on a Saturday morning and I would go in early on a Saturday to make sure that the shelter could be open a little later on Saturday so the moms could have a slow morning. I would watch the kids Saturday morning so that these moms who do not get much picture of normal life at all could like sit and quietly drink their coffee on a Saturday morning knowing that their kids were driving me crazy instead of driving them crazy. And they could just take it a little slower, have that just little bit of slow Saturday morning as I shook my fist at the banks and at the government and all of that and all of these people that put these women in such a deep state of degrading struggle and pain and suffering. It's horrendous to have children to be wrenched out of your home, to be wandering the streets of Atlanta and just praying that you can end up back in a safe place. And yet, no one made them get these loans. No one made them buy more house than they could afford. No They bore some of the responsibility for what landed them in Hagar's house. Now, that didn't mean I didn't care for them any more or any less than I would have knowing whatever, Life is complicated, weird things happen, and why homeless shelters exist is because life is complicated, and weird things happen, and we care for people anyways. The simple fact is, they bore some of the blame for how they landed in this situation. And their situation is not unique. We as people really like to pass the buck and blame everyone else for our problems, right? We want to blame, and this is becoming a theme, that's a picture of what a room inside Hagar's house looked like, by the way. We tried to be nice. It is nice, it's just small. Real estate in Atlanta, not cheap. We like to blame external factors, the banks, the governments, our family, teachers, whoever, right? We find someone else to blame. Are they to blame? Yeah, partially, sometimes even a lot, sometimes even mostly. But most of the bad situations we end up in, there's at least a little kernel that's on us too. And that's uncomfortable, and we don't like to admit that, but it is also part of how this works. We are often partly responsible for our bad situations. But hear the really good news. Even if it is the situation we are in is entirely our fault, God's love, God's mercy, God's faithfulness is there for us no matter what. God's miracle of love, faithfulness, mercy, and hope is there for us no matter what percentage this thing is our fault. God's love and mercy is there for us. And let me tell you, the situation we find ourselves in Lamentations is, shall we say, lamentable. That's why it's called Lamentations. Things were not going well. This is a part of the Bible that doesn't get preached on very often, quite frankly, because it is an absolute bummer to read. Okay, Lamentations is a book of 5 poems about how sad they are, how hurt they are, how bad things are, because the Assyrians did 2 things. They destroyed the walls of Jerusalem, which in that time meant they destroyed basically what made the city, right? City needed massive walls to keep out the enemy. Those have been destroyed, and the temple, the literal seat of God, had been torn down as well. And so our poet is standing there in the midst of the rubble going, oh my God, everything is terrible. Oh my God, I'm suffering an existential theological crisis. Oh my God, people are dying in the streets and there are parents who can't care for their children, and it really just doesn't make for fun Sunday morning reading. It's fun. And on top of that, the core thesis of the text is basically, yeah, all this bad stuff is happening and we kind of deserve it. We really messed up. We were warned it was going to go bad. It went bad. It's terrible. And we 100% deserve what happened. Fun. Joy. It's like so a few years ago, there's this thing called emo rock, and you can picture, got a picture, this is emo rock, okay? It's with the weird hair and the super gaunt look and the heavy eyeshadow, right? This is the Bible's emo rock album of like just crying out to the world, oh my God, everything is sad and terrible. I am living in an abyss of eternal sadness. Fun fact, that's the band My Chemical Romance. I once worked a gig for them and food poisoned them on accident. Ask me after class how that happened, but that's like a national touring, only time I ever worked, one of the few times I got to work with a national touring act, and I gave them food poisoning. I should not have been put in charge of picking up the catering, apparently. So we have this text about wallowing in the pit of eternal sadness, and yet I titled this sermon about hope. There's so much more to hope for. You have so much more to hope for. What on earth am I talking about? Why are we finding hope in the book of Lamentations? It's literally called the Lament book, written theoretically, at least traditionally, by the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah had warned them, it's going to go bad. And then there's these 5 poems about just how bad it went. Well, it turns out that in this book of Lamentations, in this book of the abyss of sadness, there is an edge of hope. Is it a bright, shining beacon that casts out all the darkness? No, I'll fully admit it's not. But there is that edge of hope in the midst of the rubble. You see, these 5 poems, 4 of them, are written in this incredibly structured way. And poetry is often a way of venting, of sorting through one's emotions. But they wrote these 4 of these poems in this super structured way called an acrostic. And basically that meant that, okay, each verse begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order. And there are 22 verses to these poems, and that means there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So I'll do this in English because I don't speak Hebrew, and I bet neither do you. So imagine this in English. That means verse 1 would start with A, and verse 2 would start with B, and verse 3 would start with C, D, E, F, on through Z. Right? So basically they're saying 2 things. 1, the destruction was complete. The destruction ran from A to Z. It's complete destruction, complete devastation. But it is also them trying to give structure to it, trying to wrap their head around what happened. And that's the same thing that happens in therapy, right? You go to therapy after a trauma to try and wrap your head around what happened, to try to give your brain some structure to try and process it. Lamentations is in part hopeful because it is a work at processing the pain and processing the trauma to begin to work through it. The other part that's hopeful about Lamentations is in the middle of poem 3, where we are today. They begin that work at trying to see some hope. It's, again, not the bright, shining, overwhelming beacon like walking from a dark room out into the light, but it is still a steadfast light. Here again, verses 22 through 26. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul that seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. God is faithful. God has mercy. Around them is rubble, is abject devastation. It has all gone very wrong. But they see something, the author sees something in the character of God, in who God is. That how powerful God's love is, how important God's faithfulness, how much of God's mercy there is. And so they look up and they look around and they say, things are bad right now. There's the wormwood and the gall, but I know who God is. I know how powerful God is, and I know how merciful God is. And so I choose to hope in God to be more powerful than whatever brokenness I may have caused in my life, or whatever brokenness that me plus the Assyrians have caused in my life, whoever your Assyrians might be. No matter what, God remains faithful. The character of God is to be loving and merciful and faithful, and so they can have hope and faith in that. That's what they can hold on to, even while they look around and see devastation. Hope that God is who God is, and that God is more powerful than whatever problems we might cause in our own lives, or whatever problems might be wreaked upon our own lives by the Assyrians, who did a really good job of reducing Jerusalem to rubble. One of the things to remember about these miracles of restoration, about God's faithfulness and about God's mercy, is that sometimes it feels like to our eyes that it happens in slow motion. Some of God's miracles are slow motion miracles, not the ones we want them on double speed or triple speed. If you remember, if you ever lived with a VCR, you could like speed it up and go, No, it's not like that. It's where you hit that weird half-speed button and it moves slightly too slowly. Sometimes that's the miracles of God, are slow motion miracles, where we can only see them, that they even happen when we look back, because they happen so incrementally at the time that we don't notice what's going on. Think about even our story today. They are lamenting the fact the walls have been knocked down and the temple has been torn down and they're going to exile. Lamentations opens with, "How empty is the city of the Lord?" Well, someday they do get to go back. And in the book of Nehemiah, they rebuild Jerusalem and are allowed to stay and thrive. And the temple that gets built under Nehemiah stands for another 600-700 years until that one gets knocked over by the Romans. And we still haven't rebuilt the third one yet. They'll get there someday. Life is long. But that process took decades. They spent a generation in exile. And then even once they got back, it takes a while in, the world 3,000 years ago to build mighty walls of stone and to build a beautiful temple unto the Lord. It happened in slow motion. But God was faithful. God did restore the city. God did show them mercy, even if they didn't deserve it. To give you an image relevant to our own time, think about how you felt on 9/11 of 2001, when the planes flew into the Twin Towers and just devastation reigned, literally rained down. And what you were left with was this pile of twisted steel and rubble in New York that looked, at least to my 15-year-old eyes, incomprehensibly huge. I remember thinking, nothing good can ever come of this. It's just going to sit there in rubble forever. And for months, that's kind of what happened. It took months even to clear away the rubble to get down to some sort of site that could be built upon. And then it took 15 more years for something to rise up from that rubble, from that ashes. And yet, they did it. There's a building there today, a beautiful, tall skyscraper of glass and steel, and a beautiful memorial in remembrance of what happened, and a beautiful museum so that we never forget, and a beautiful transportation hub so that the people of New York can use it. And so I want you to watch what happened over an 11-year period. It's only going to take 2 minutes, I promise. You guys are still going to get to lunch, I promise. But watch 11 years in 2 minutes to see a slow motion miracle. That if you were to watch this day to day, you wouldn't see much. But when you zoom out a little bit, you're going to see something remarkable. Also, the music is good. So that's 2004. That 2-minute clip represented 2004 to 2015. And again, if you watched it a day at a time, it wouldn't have looked like much. Remember, we started down in that pit, and for like what looked like forever, it just looked like things piling dirt all over the place. And then slowly, incrementally, a building built, and a place of abject devastation became a symbol of hope and resolve. That is a slow motion miracle. And that's the kind of miracle God can work in our lives when we're in a bad situation, when we're down in a hole of devastation and rubble. God is faithful. God is merciful. God is loving. God will help us through it. It just may not always look like it immediately at the time. Sitting in the devastation of Jerusalem, you don't think that someday you're going to be back worshiping in a temple that no longer exists, and yet that is what happens. That's the kind of hope we can have in the Lord. My friends, we have to choose to hope. We have to choose to hope. Hope is not something that's just going to fall in our laps. It's something we have to grab onto. That's the other message of today's text. That's the message of verse 21. Hear verse 21 again. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Hear how active that is. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. It sounds pretty active in English. Apparently in Hebrew, which I do not read, scholars will tell me it is extremely active. It is basically, I cause myself to think this, I cause myself to hope. Hope is an act of trusting what God is doing. It is something that must be grabbed onto and held onto. You could sit in the rubble and say, oh, that's rubble, I guess it's all over. Or you can sit in the rubble and remember how faithful God is and choose to grab and hold onto that and allow that slow, incremental, slow motion miracle to happen. First refugee camp I ever went to was Dahisha refugee camp in Bethlehem. The people in Palestine, not Palestine, it's the other one, spelled the same, is a country. It's very confusing. The people who had been there, who were living there, had been living in that refugee camp for a whole generation. In this place of thrown together houses and trash and rubble. Now, they had been there since the late 40s to starting in the late 40s to mid 50s. They'd been living in a refugee camp. And so things would seem hopeless if grandparents, parents, and children had all lived a lot of their lives or their entire lives in rubble and devastation. But when you talk to the families of Dahisha refugee camp, a lot of them will show you a key. Now, this is not the key to the house they're living in. It's the key to the house they lost through a generation of fighting and turmoil. And those houses that those keys are to don't exist anymore. They're gone. And yet they hold on to that key as a sign of their hope in the future. Their hope in the midst of the rubble, their choice to actively choose to trust in God's faithfulness. That's what it looks like to choose hope. Choosing hope isn't just about, oh yes, I can clearly see where the problem will end. No, choosing hope is looking around, seeing it's all bad, and deciding to trust in the character of God anyways, because that's how God is more powerful than whatever situation you're in. But you have to choose to hope. You have to choose to trust. You have to set your mind on God's mercies, which are new for you every day. Let us